The weight of emptiness. Rafik sat on the dusty pavement near the market with his small wooden box beside him. His fingers were stained with black polish, and his clothes hung loose on his thin frame. Every morning he sat up at the same spot hoping to earn enough for a meal. His work was simple. He cleaned shoes for people who rarely looked at him. He worked in silence, watching their footsteps more than their faces. Had been doing this for years without any change. Each day looked just like the last. People passed by in a hurry. Some dropped a coin without a word. Some did not stop at all. There were days he did not eat, and nights when he slept on an empty stomach with only a torn blanket covering him. He had no family, no friends, and no hope. Life felt like a long dark tunnel with no end. Rafik often thought about his past. He remembered his father who worked as a daily laborer, and his mother who died when he was very young. He had started working at the age of 10 when his father fell ill and never recovered. He never went to school, never had toys, never had dreams. He only knew how to survive one hot afternoon as the sun burned the ground and the smell of sweat filled the air. Rafik was sitting on his usual spot polishing the shoes of a young man in a suit. The man was busy on his phone, not saying a word. Suddenly an old man with a white beard and calm eyes stopped nearby and watched him for a while. Old man said something that caught Rafik off guard. "You polish shoes like it's a punishment. What if you polished like you were building your future?" Rafik looked up confused. But before he could reply, the old man walked away, blending into the crowd. His words stayed behind like a shadow. That night, Rafik could not sleep. He lay under his broken stall, staring at the stars. His mind replayed the words of the old man again and again. He thought about the way he worked, the way he saw himself, the way he hated every part of his life. What if the man was right? What if the problem was not the job? How he did I? They remembered the faces of the people who passed him every day. They never saw him because he never saw himself as someone worth noticing. He was always angry, always tired, always silent. The next morning something shifted. It was not big, but it was real. He sat in the same spot with the same box, but he did something he never did before. He smiled at the first customer who came to him. The man seemed surprised. Rafik greeted him softly and cleaned his shoes with care, not rushing, not complaining. He even wiped the soles gently and gave them an extra shine. The man looked down at his shoes and said, "You're good at this." Rafik nodded, his heart beating faster than usual. That was the first time someone had complimented his work in years. That day he kept smiling, he kept greeting. He cleaned every shoe like it mattered. He even said thank you after receiving coins. Something inside him had changed by evening. He had earned more than usual, not a lot but enough for a full meal and a small packet of sweets. He gave the sweets to a hungry child sitting on the sidewalk. The boy's smile touched something deep in Rafik's chest. As he walked back to his sleeping spot, he looked at his hands. Still black from polish, but they looked different now. Not dirty, not tired, but strong, capable hands that could build something. He sat down under the dark sky and whispered to himself, "Maybe one thought really can change something." City lights shimmered in the distance as he closed his eyes. His world was still the same, but something inside him was not. He felt a quiet hope for the first time in years. Not much had changed yet, but the way he saw himself had taken a small step forward, and sometimes one step is all it takes to begin a new path. One thought that changed it all. Rafik woke up before sunrise. His small blanket was still wrapped around him, but the air felt cooler than usual. The streets were quiet, and the sky was turning from black to soft gray. He sat up and looked around. Everything was the same, yet something inside him felt new. He walked slowly to the market, carrying his old wooden box. His steps were steady and calm. The voices in his head were no longer heavy. with blame and sadness. Instead they were silent, waiting for the day to begin. He reached his spot near the tea stall and set up as always, but this time he arranged his tools neatly. He cleaned his brushes, checked the polish bottles, and wiped the wooden box with a cloth. Then he sat straight, waiting with a quiet smile. The first man to stop that day was a fruit seller. His shoes were dusty and worn. Rafik greeted him politely and began working with care. He brushed gently, shined evenly, and even cleaned the edges of the soles. The fruit seller watched silently, then said, "You treat shoes like gold." "Now what happened?" Rafik looked up and replied softly, "I started treating my work like it matters." The fruit seller smiled and handed him a few extra coins before walking away. Rafik felt a strange warmth in his chest. It was not about the money, it was about being seen, about being respected. More people started noticing him. A woman in a yellow shawl came by and asked if he could clean her son's school shoes. Rafik nodded and took extra care with them. The woman thanked him and said she would tell her neighbors by afternoon. Rafik had served more customers than he usually did in a whole day. He remained calm and kind to each one, offering water and sometimes a sweet smile. His hands moved with skill and patience. Every stroke of the brush, every wipe of the cloth, felt like a silent prayer. One man came to him wearing polished leather shoes and expensive clothes. He stood still for a while, then said, "You used to look angry. Now you look like a man who owns this place." Rafik laughed softly and said, "I don't own anything, but I started owning my work." The man nodded, impressed. He handed Rafik his card and said, "I run a shop nearby. If you ever want to polish shoes in front of my store, you are welcome. There's more shade there and more customers." Rafik looked at the card with disbelief. He had never imagined anyone would offer him such a thing. He bowed slightly and said, "Thank you, I will come tomorrow." That night Rafik could not sleep again. But this time it was not because of hunger or pain. It was because of excitement and hope. He stared at the card for a long time, then placed it under his pillow like it was treasure. Next morning he moved to the new location near the man's shop. It was cleaner and had more people walking by. Within an hour, he had 5 customers. All of them looked satisfied and left with kind words. Some even asked if he had more helpers or if he repaired shoes. Rafik realized that his one thought, his one small decision to work with pride, had opened a new door. He was not just polishing shoes anymore. He was creating something. He was building a name. Days passed, and Rafik kept growing. Slowly people began to call him by name. They came to him not just for clean shoes, but for a moment of peace and kindness. He would talk to them, listen to their worries, share a joke or a kind word. One afternoon, while he was polishing an old man's shoes, a small boy stood nearby watching him. Rafik noticed the boy was barefoot and hungry. He called him over, gave him water, and asked where his parents were. The boy said he had no one and lived near the garbage dump. Rafik saw himself in the boy. He gave him food and offered to teach him how to polish shoes. The boy's eyes lit up with hope, and he nodded quickly. From that day, Rafik had a helper. He taught the boy how to clean, how to care, how to smile. The boy followed every step, watching closely and learning fast. People noticed the boy too. They admired Rafik for helping him. Some offered extra coins. Some brought old shoes for the boy to practice on. One woman even gifted Rafik a small umbrella for shade. The shopkeeper who had given Rafik the space watched all this with quiet pride. One evening he came out and said, "You have changed this corner of the street. It feels different now." Better. Rafik smiled and replied, "It started with one thought, and now it feels like everything is changing." Slowly the shopkeeper nodded, then handed Rafik a folded paper. Inside was a small offer to rent a tiny shop at the end of the lane. The price was low, and the space was just enough for one man and a helper. Rafik stared at the paper in silence. His hands trembled slightly. He never thought he would be offered a shop, a real space, a place to belong. He looked up at the sky and closed his eyes for a moment. The same sky he used to sleep under with nothing but a torn blanket. Now it was watching him grow step by step. The boy stood beside him holding the shoe brush and looking curious. Rafik placed his hand on the boy's shoulder and said softly, "Maybe this is just the beginning." In his heart he knew it was true. The quiet rise, the small shop, stood at the corner of the lane. It had one wooden bench, a few hooks on the wall, and a tiny window facing the market. It was not much, but to Rafik it felt like a palace. He swept the floor himself, cleaned the walls, and painted a small sign above the door: Rafik Shoe Repair and Shine Service. The letters were crooked but full of pride. He moved his box inside, placed his tools on the shelf, and laid out 2 small chairs, one for the customer and one for the boy who now stayed with him like a younger brother. Every morning they opened the shop early. Rafik would polish while the boy watched and slowly started helping. The shop began to attract more people. Some came for the shine, some came for the smile. A young teacher from the school nearby came one day. She sat down quietly and said, "I have been watching you for weeks. You treat your work like art." Rafik bowed his head and said, "Work becomes art when the heart is in it." The teacher smiled and placed a small notebook on the table. She said, "Teach the boy to read. He has bright eyes. He deserves a future." Rafik opened the notebook and looked at the letters. They felt strange but full of possibility. He nodded and promised to learn with the boy. The boy who once lived on the streets now smiled without fear. He read stories from the notebook, helped customers, and even dreamed of opening his own shop one day. Rafik sat on the bench watching the world pass by. His heart felt light, his eyes calmer. Man once lost in his thoughts had now built a life from a single change in mindset. He knew his journey was not finished, but he also knew that the worst part was over. He had found something many rich people never find: peace through purpose and pride through work. The market kept moving, the people kept passing, but in the corner of the lane, a quiet shop stood as a reminder. One thought had changed everything, and it still was changing lives. And enjoyed this story? Like it and subscribe for more.